Okay, so we're doing our lesson 3.3 add-on. And we're working on objective 4, which is evaluating functions. And we are going to evaluate h of r equals 1/3 r plus 2. There's our function we're going to be evaluating. We're going to be putting some domain values in and get the corresponding range value. And we're going to evaluate it for r equals 600 and for r equals -12. So they gave us two different domain values. And they want us to evaluate the function at those domains and figure out what would be the corresponding range value. So the proper notation to show this is h of 600, the function evaluated at 600 would be done by putting into the function rule the 600 for the r. So we substitute the 600 in for the r into our function rule, which says take 1/3 of the x value, or the r value, and add 2. Okay, so what is 1/3 of 600? 200. And 200 plus 2 is? 202. So we would say that h of 600 is equal to 202. So which one of those numbers is going in the domain? The 600, if we were going to write the domain for this, one of the numbers that would be in the domain is 600, and then what's going to be in the range because of 600 being in the domain? 202 would be in the range because of 600 being in the domain. So now let's do it when we have h of -12. And we substitute in our independent variable value of -12, our domain value. And we say, okay, what's positive times a negative? Negative. And 1/3 of 12 is? -4. So we get -4, don't we? And -4 plus 2 is? -2. So h of -12 is -2. Okay, where's -12 going in? If I ask you to put it in the correct location? In the domain. And where's -2 going? In the range. Yeah. Okay. So we could keep evaluating, we could just keep picking domain values, which is typically what we do. We pick the domain value, somebody picked them for us here. But we pick the domain value, remember the independent variables, the control variable. We pick it, we put it into the function rule, we see what we get for the output. What is the dependent value because of that? And so that's all we're really practicing here. And we do a lot of that when we start graphing. Okay? Anybody got questions about evaluating functions? Did those go well in the homework? Everyone okay? Okay, then what's our other objective? Objective 5. Okay, so we're finding objective 5 is finding a reasonable, is that the word they use?
Reasonable domain and range.
Yeah, finding a reasonable domain and range. For a function, right? Okay. Well, I'm pretty sure we all have figured out now what a domain is, right? We all figured out what a range is. I think we're feeling pretty good about what a function is. Well then what in the world do they mean by a reasonable domain and range for a function? What do they mean by that? What does that mean to you when they say to you, I want you to find a reasonable domain and range for a certain function? one that you can get along with. Find the domain and range according to the situation, right? Because not every number makes sense in a situation, does it? Like if let's say the independent variable is representing the number of months, what would not be reasonable when you're talking about the number of months? -2. That would be an unreasonable domain value, wouldn't it? Because you can't have negative time. Yeah, you can't have -2 months. Even if we go back in time and talk about, back in September, we don't say, a -2 months ago. That isn't how we talk, do we? We say 2 months ago, knowing that that means go backwards. So when we talk about reasonable domain and range, we have to say, well, sometimes according to the situation, there are restrictions. Okay, so here, I want you to write this down. We're going to find a reasonable domain and range for this situation. Joe has enough money to purchase 1, 2, or 3 DVDs at $15 each. Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to decide, because we're going to write a function, but before we write a function, we're going to decide what would the independent variable be representing? What would the dependent variable be representing? So independent called the independent variable. What's it going to represent in this situation? By the way, we'll just let it be x. Okay, is that okay? Okay, so we'll let x be the independent variable. And what's it going to represent in this situation? Number of DVDs? Yeah, I think that's probably the controlling situation, isn't it? Number of DVDs represents, it's going to be our independent variable. It's going to be the input. And y, our dependent variable.
That'd be the total cost.
Yeah, that'd be our total cost, wouldn't it? How much it's going to cost altogether. So again, we're just going to write a function that represents this situation, and then from there, we're going to find a reasonable domain and range. So what kind of a function could we write to represent what's happening here? Function, I want an equation.
Oh.
F of x? X is representing the number of DVDs. Each one costs $15, right? And f of x is representing the total cost. Now notice right now we did not worry about the 1, 2, or 3. We don't care about that right now, do we? Right now we just care about, oh, he's going to buy some DVDs. We don't know how many. We know that they're $15 a piece, and according to that, that'll be dependent on how much he's going to spend. Okay? So now we should be able to say, okay, what is the domain? What's a reasonable domain for this situation? 1, 2, 3. He only has enough money to buy one of those 3 possible DVDs. Oh, one of them, 2 of them, or 3 of them. Well then, now we evaluate that and say, oh, well, if he does buy one, f of 1, it would be 15 times 1, which is 15. There's our first what? Range value. F of 2 would be 30, because 15 times 2 is 30. So there's our next reasonable range value. And f of 3. 15 times 3, 45. So for this particular situation, a function to represent would be f of x equals 15x. Reasonable domain, 1, 2, or 3. What happens when he does buy 1, 2, or 3? 15, 30, or 45, right? So sometimes we have to determine, we have set numbers that go into our domain, which then output for us set values in our range also. Okay, so just a little bit more practice on that to make sure that you're knowing how to show the word properly and the correct notation in there. Does anybody have any questions?